Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Ellis, PFC's research coordinator, and welcome to another edition of PFC's Webinar Wednesdays. Today, we will be taking the time to discuss why a data strategy for the philanthropic sector has the potential to further coordination, collaboration, and the mobilization of long-term resources, and how to ensure that we don't lose sight of promoting equity and inclusion in this process, especially during a pandemic that continues to magnify inequities within our society. So this webinar's goal is to form a common ground and language for funders, for grantmakers, grantees, and equity-seeking organizations to better speak with each other about data practices. We would like to remind our participants that there is simultaneous French interpretation available by clicking on the language settings below the video. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, as the panelists will be taking the last 15 minutes of the session to answer them. And if you'd like to follow live Twitter updates, please find us at Philanthropy CDA on Twitter. So to begin, we would like to first recognize the many territories of Turtle Island, or Canada, on which we work and reside. So these territories are home to many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. PFC itself in Montreal is located on the unceded land of the Kanien'kehá:ka, and which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. As settlers, immigrants, and their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and territory and hope for a more just future together. So moderating our panel today is PFC's Director of Learning and Partnerships, Inez Shalala, who co-organized this panel along with myself and Merve Gouvendiran, PFC's Communications and Mobilization Coordinator. So Inez has worked with PFC the last 3 years, where she leads the development and implementation of PFC's learning programs, as well as strategic partnerships. In 2018, she helped launch the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program at PFC, and she also leads the Data Strategy for Funders project in partnership with the Ontario Trillium Foundation and Powered by Data. So I'll pass it over to Inez from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for the introduction and for setting the stage for our conversation today. Let me first start by introducing our panelists. We do have a great lineup, and we really invite these different perspectives to support the conversation and really help us move forward with the data strategy for funders project, but also as a philanthropic sector in general. So I'll start with Chris Archie. Chris is the Chief Executive Officer of the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada. In all of her roles, Chris works to transform philanthropy and contribute to positive change by creating spaces of learning, relationship building, and activation. Just to note that I will be providing the short bios of our panelists, but the long version is going to be put in our chat box. Next is Dr. Srividya Iyer. She is the Scientific Clinical Director of Access Open Minds, a national youth mental health services research network established under CIHR's Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research. In this role, she provides leadership to the development, implementation, and evaluation of a transformation of youth mental health services at 14 sites in 6 provinces in 1 territory. She is also a researcher at the Douglas Hospital Research Center and a psychologist at the Prevention and Early Intervention Program for Psychosis in Montreal. Tasha Lackman is currently the Vice President of Philanthropy and Community at Foundation of Greater Montreal, Fondation du Grand Montréal, and is also a lawyer. Prior to her arrival at the foundation, Tasha was the Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives at McGill University. Orville Wallace currently serves as the Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives with the Laidlaw Foundation, where he oversees the grant-making process of all funding programs and strategic framework for the foundation. Orville has a strong passion for youth advocacy and topics related to youth justice. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. So let's get started. We have prepared 3-4 questions to go around our panelists, and I'll start with the first question for Tasha. So Tasha, in your own perspective, how would you define data and its practices in advancing accountability and long-term resource mobilization? And can you give us an example of what your foundation is doing with it in this regard? Tasha?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Really nice to see you all, although I can't actually see you, but I'm going to pretend that I can see you. So I think that just as a starting point, it's important to think about why we're all here together. And I think we're all here today because we recognize that there's an issue of systemic racism, that it's a real issue. And not only that, but also our sector, the philanthropic sector, is lagging behind. And even though our sector is really at the center of trying to promote justice and equity, I think we're failing at this. And many of us are asking, what are the concrete actions that we can take to influence our organizations, our sector, and our systems? And I would say, I would hope that data collection may be one of those low-hanging fruits. Data is a way that we can move forward quickly, put something in place quickly, and at the same time be doing that much slower work of shifting cultures. And I would also put forward that data can help us to do that work of shifting culture. So why data? I think there's 3 reasons why data is important when we're defining data, which is part of the question. So one, I think data can name a situation. It can help us create a deeper and shared understanding, in this case around issues of race and intersectionality. I think the second reason that data is really important is because it can influence decision makers. Evidence leads to action. There's a lot of euphemisms around this. We hear all the time, what gets measured gets done. We measure what matters. There's all kinds of ways that we talk about how data can influence decision makers. So I think that's the second reason why this is an important topic. And the third reason I think that data is important is because if we start to collect data, we can create a baseline of where we are right now, and then we can evaluate our progress, and we can see how and where we're improving, and also where we're continuing to lag behind. So I'm going to tell you a cautionary, I mentioned that I think data can be a low-hanging fruit and a place where we can take action quickly, but I wanted to share a cautionary tale as well about data. So I have the privilege of being part of a small working group of foundations based in Montreal, and we're working together to try to collect data on the same data points related to the organizations we're funding and the populations that we're serving, really with the idea that if we're a few organizations that are collecting this data together, then we can tell a more compelling story at the end of next year after our first year of collecting this data. We're also thought that by working together, we can test ideas and really create a safe space to explore together and make sure that we're working in the right way. So I don't think it will come as a surprise to any of you here today that we wanted to collect data on how many Black-led organizations, Black serving organizations, Indigenous-led, Indigenous serving. So how are we going to define what's Black-led, what's Indigenous-led? So this became important to us. So we started to think about it and talk about it. And I went off and I had seen a bunch of programs that were BIPOC-led or to support BIPOC-led organizations. So I went off and I found a couple of definitions, played with them, and ultimately there's 2 pieces. There's a question on leadership, there's a question on governance, and then there's a question of how much leadership and governance is Black or Indigenous or women or whichever group. And so I sent a couple of these definitions to an Indigenous woman who's in the sector who I really trust. And I said, what do you think of these definitions? Well, which one should I use? And I had put the source of the different definitions. And I think I'm going to read her answer to you because I think that it is really important to think about as we move forward. And she wrote, I think it's important to ask who created the definitions. If they were created by the peoples they serve, then I would consider it valid. Otherwise, it is still practicing a top-down approach. The government of Ontario, which was one of the definitions I had put forward through Trillium, is using the Indian Act model of chief counsel, etc. While there has to be room for this, the ill relationship of the top-down model may not be the most innovative to create change in the communities. So why do I share this with you? Because even the data we're collecting or how we're choosing to define the data points is crucial. And I think this leads to the second part of the question that Ines asked around accountability. So who do we want to be accountable to when we're collecting data? Clearly, as organizations, we need to be accountable to our boards and to our other stakeholders, but I would like to put forward that we also want to be accountable to the communities that we want to serve, or that we're purporting to serve in our work. And I think so that the process of collecting data is as important as the data that we're collecting. And as I say this, I want to be sure, or I hope that this complexity doesn't paralyze us, because there is complexity. We need to face it head on, but it can't stop us from moving forward. Because I really think that and at least the way I'm thinking about this is that I'm on a learning journey. We have to be asking questions. We have to be consulting, but we have to balance that with what I sense as a great urgency in also moving to action. So with that, I'll leave it back to Ines.
Thank you, Tasha, and thank you for putting this issue into context and really asking the question around accountability and who we are accountable towards. I'll go with Dr. Iyer now from Access Open Minds. Your perspective on this.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, Tasha, for starting off with some very insightful questions about data. Just a little bit of context, because I think a lot of what we share and our perspectives do come from our background and experience. So, as I'm a psychologist by training, but I'm a faculty member at McGill University. So a lot of what I end up doing is around data and data of various sorts. And I have my areas of interest are really in youth mental health, using data, among other things, to improve the access to and quality of services for young people with mental health problems, both in Canada and globally. I still do some work in India, which is where I originally come from. And in this process, I think there are some really sort of important questions, and I'll use some examples as well. Currently we're talking about, first of all, I think the questions around like, what is data is actually a very multi-layered question. So like, do we consider numbers as data? Do we consider stories as data? Who uses the data? Who gets to design and label what gets called data, especially since this is a panel that's talking about inclusion and equity? Who gets to interpret data, and who gets to make decisions with the data? Like, these are all sort of really critical questions. And yet there is incredible power in data to advance these same things that we're quite concerned around, whether it's like better lives, equity, or inclusion. A good example would be, and the reason it is quite complex is around COVID times. I don't know how many of you were aware, there was a lot of controversy in Canada about whether we should be collecting race and ethnicity data around who gets tested, whose mortality outcomes get, like whether we should link it with race and ethnicity. And it was a back and forth. And finally, some provinces did end up collecting it. And at least the initial data from Ontario, from England, clearly shows that there are patterns around race and ethnicity and COVID outcomes, which suggest that some of the structural inequities that we see are manifested in terms of the poorer outcomes. And if we didn't have that data, we wouldn't be able to make that case. Another example in Canada, there's multiple things that have been moved because of data. So data does have a lot of power, but there are also examples historically of data being used in manners that have been quite harmful to many communities, whether it is, certainly Indigenous communities in Canada, but also in the field of psychology and mental health, there's plenty of examples of data having been really used to discriminate and paint a picture of Black peoples in the US as having so data can also be very harmful. So I think there are some, in the context of a project, you mentioned the Access Open Minds project. So the Access Open Minds project has been a really good journey in terms of thinking through some of these questions for me. So it's a pan-Canadian network. It was funded through a partnership between a philanthropic foundation and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. They came together to create this project. And currently what we are doing is we're working with 16, it is a network of 16 communities across Canada, working to improve mental health services for young people. It's a network that has young people, families, service providers, clinicians, Indigenous communities, decision makers, and policy makers. And because it was funded as a research project, data was a key aspect of this project. But because the goal was really from the very beginning to actually transform systems, and so real outcomes for real people, it's really changed the way you would normally think about data. So who got to design it were multiple stakeholders. The purposes of data were also multifold, like data for advocacy, data for sharing stories of communities, data for identifying who comes to services and who doesn't come to services. So data can really have many purposes and can be very powerful if it is aligned from the beginning by the right values and the right people around the table shaping and designing those values. I think at least in health and social services, one other thing that's really changing is because you asked about accountability, what's really changing is instead of using data only for accountability to the funder or accountability to, say, for instance, in my case, like the scientific community, we really are changing those definitions to say data should be most accountable to the people whose data it is. Like, so how can we collect data that is meaningful to real people in real contexts and use it in manners collaboratively so the data can actually be used for change rather than simply as an end of project accountability. So in healthcare, for instance, we're now talking a lot about learning health systems. So systems of healthcare that collect data and in real time learn from that data to further improve services and identify gaps, rather than simply sort of say, here's the data that we send to the ministry or to a philanthropic foundation. How can data, which is really important, accountability is really important, but data for sustainability, data for scale up, for advocacy, and really bringing, if possible, within data, not just the head, but also a lot of the heart, that's very important and can get lost sometimes in data initiatives. I'm sure there's going to be a few different things to pick up, and I hope it was a good start.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyer. So the title of our webinar today is Data for Equity and Ensuring Inclusive Philanthropy. And you just talked about the power in data. And so, Chris, what does data equity and inclusive philanthropy mean for your organization? And can you give us an example on how you are addressing this, Chris?
Sure. Wait, good morning. Thank you for the invitation here and to be in this conversation. I remember when we did the planning conversation, one of the first things I said was like, I don't think and I'm not an expert in data, but I love to ask questions, and I love to develop questions and have people answer them and work with them, and definitely come from a mindset that we like at the Circle to be an organization that asks more questions than we have answers. Because as Dr. Iyer was saying, it is as much the process of getting to the answer as it is actually finding the answer that is important. So one of the things that I would say is that data equity and inclusive philanthropy means specifically for the Circle on Philanthropy, it does, as was already mentioned, create an opportunity for us to actually reorient and name a situation in the specific case of measuring the Circle 1 and measuring the Circle 2.0. Being able to name and identify the ways in which settler-created philanthropic dollars are going to Indigenous-led or Indigenous benefiting charitable organizations helps us tell a story about the reality of funding and support that goes to this important work. And that becomes necessary because if we want to influence decision makers and help them see the disparity between, all of the issues that the philanthropic sector seeks to serve and understand and mitigate against, If we can't make the connection between those issues and those who are most harmed by the systemic racism and oppression that exists in this country, we will continue to just perpetuate more harm, right? If we can't name it, if we can't be at the helm of designing the questions, doing the sense making that is required, then we continue to actually perpetuate white supremacy. So in the case of our organization, being able to tell a more accurate picture related to funding means that we can help mobilize and move settler-created philanthropic organizations who are serious about thinking and doing work differently in a unique way. Tasha mentioned earlier, this question about like, well, what's the difference between Indigenous-led, Indigenous-informed organizations that are Indigenous benefiting? The Circle, Measuring the Circle 2.0 worked with a community of Indigenous folks out of Manitoba who helped create a definitional matrix out of the recognition for Measuring the Circle 1 that the first data grab about how much money was going to Indigenous charitable organizations didn't actually differentiate between an organization like, say, the Boys and Girls Club that is serving young Indigenous people and the local Friendship Center. And there is a massive, important programmatic governance and operational framework that is totally distinct between these organizations, and therefore they need to be expressed. So Connected, one of the things that we're doing, especially in this moment in time where the murder of George Floyd and the continued harm on BIPOC bodies and lives, the sector's starting to recognize that we need to move in the direction of racial equity. We've been asked by partners to look at expanding our existing definitional matrix to support BIPOC organizations and other equity-seeking organizations. This is one of the only definitions we've seen that actually is led by equity-seeking folks and individuals, and I think it has a lot to offer. And absolutely that the expansion of the definitional matrix must also engage the voices of people who will be impacted and affected by the data that is gathered. So that's just I'll stop there. I could go on and on, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. So Orville, what are your thoughts about this issue of data equity, inclusive philanthropy, and how is your foundation dealing with this?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Inez. Thanks for inviting me to this conversation. I'm very happy to contribute. So first of all, I just want to pause and just acknowledge the impact of the pandemic that it's having on Black, Indigenous, racialized communities and the disproportionalities that we're seeing. That's a huge thing to first acknowledge the current landscape and how it's played a role in philanthropy. So from data equity, what it means for our foundation, it means granting with a mindset that not everyone has the ability to address the needs within their communities. And this is due to their identities and their social location. So it's really important that from our perspective at the Laylaw Foundation, inclusive philanthropy at Laylaw starts with ensuring that our policies are in place, our practices give marginalized communities true philanthropic support. And when I say true philanthropic support, it means really looking at nailing down on giving marginalized communities the opportunities that don't further add to existing inequities. So inclusive philanthropy, what that means is beginning with making equity a key part of our foundation's culture and our strategy. And we've made that very apparent at our Laylaw within our current 5-year strategy. And it starts from the top and bottom up. So what we say there is, from my perspective, for philanthropy to advance equity, it must first understand the demographics of the organizations that we're funding, that we're being funded, and the ones that are also being declined. So also the people being served, the communities impacted. So it's impossible to change inequity in grant making at the organizational level if you cannot see where the inequities first exist. And where they lie by the demographics, as for example, by using demographics as a key metric, you'll be able to see and understand how your shifts towards equitable grant making practice are showing up within your results. And that's one of the things we've definitely been using at the Laylaw Foundation. We've taken bold measures in terms of making an effort to diversify our staff, our board members, and we're continuing to further that cause. We're also making bold measures. We're making an effort to apply practices that are proven to reduce bias. So these are the technical things, so such as the language within our questions, within our grant applications, allowing for budget reallocations for technology deployment during this pandemic, and also within the amount awarded to certain grantees. And these are grantees specifically from underserved populations. So we've also reduced the restrictions that we've placed on unincorporated grassroots applicants to access the dollar. So accessibility is another key portion right there. So we have this fund that's that's being responsive, that's offered through the United Way and the community foundations of Canada, and that was really to respond to support the sector. But we really need to see and do some data after that to see if it's really reaching these unincorporated groups that really need it the most, in terms of giving them access to obtain and access those dollars to do their work. So that's just a bit in terms of what I'll stop by right there in terms of saying what Laidlaw is doing.
Thank you so much, Orville. Let's go to the next question, and perhaps I can continue with Orville on this one. So we all know that data gaps do exist in philanthropy, and we've seen a bit of it, or a lot of it, during the COVID-19 pandemic at the start, in last March. So how do you think these gaps are affecting or impacting, influencing the relationships you have with your partners, grantees, and how do you think we can do better in the sector? Orville?
Yeah, great question. It's super important that we don't take a blind eye to this issue in terms of the data gaps. Data, as we mentioned, can be good as well as data can be bad, but the data gaps are affecting the relationships between funders and grantees, and that if funders are not addressing these gaps, we're going to continue to see funders fund the same groups over and over again with a blind eye towards addressing the gaps, towards addressing gaps where funding is traditionally underrepresented. And when I say underrepresented, so the data must then be used to drive change in the grant making practice. And what that means is embedding the data within addressing the data. So it's one thing to have data, but if you're not actioning the data after, then that's a problem. So the data must then be used to drive change in grant making practice in terms of decision making, the whole overarching grant making strategy, our designs, and grant makers can also help by funding grantees towards building capacity, skill building, and education to help drive and further equity. So for me, it's seeing the gaps, meeting the need, and addressing the need, but also but looking and taking action towards addressing these gaps. And as what we're seeing now and what it's highlighted through COVID-19 is the issue of anti-Black racism, and it's always been there, but now it's being further magnified through this pandemic. And now the data will definitely help towards driving change from focusing that lens now on underrepresented communities and communities that need to be served the most. We understand anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. They're like social cancers, and they'll be here forever unless we collectively make an impact to break down the systems that are perpetuating them. Because right now, as we know, there's no vaccine for anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism. We really need to look at how we can take this moment to really address the issues and bring it to light, but not just bring it to light, keep the conversation going, have this embedded within our strategies, educate ourselves, grant makers, our grant making strategies, and build in a way in which our decisions are made so that they're making real impact and change, and we're not seeing the typical funders that get addressed, because there's grassroots groups that are doing amazing work, and we want to keep them on the landscape, and that's where the data will help us even move that conversation forward.
Thank you, Orville. Yeah, seeing the gaps, meeting the needs, and addressing those needs. I thought that was very well said and put. Chris, what's your perspective on this?
first. Just thank you, Orville, for your sharing and your analysis. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I just really appreciate it. I mean, I guess so this question is really the one is, how are these gaps affecting relationships between funders and grantees? And so speaking about what we hear as the circle from Indigenous organizations, Indigenous-led and informed organizations, and their connection with philanthropic organizations, it really turns into a lack of trust and as well a lack of focus on learning and relationships. And I think this is really important to name because there's often a lot of conversation about how, like, let's increase the capacity of organizations to do data and research, et cetera, et cetera. I actually think that it needs to be flipped on its head and that recognize that actually the muscles that need to get built and the capacity gaps actually exist inside of philanthropic organizations. And so philanthropic organizations collect a myriad of data points, stories, and information. And many, many organizations actually don't even have the capacity to do the sense making required to take what they're learning from grantees and adjust, say, grant making strategies and others. I think perhaps there are some out there who are trying to do that well, but typically organizations sit on years of reports and progress reports and final reports without very little understanding of how it is that they can make sense of particular issues and how they can influence change. So I really think that settler created philanthropy is the one that needs to do some capacity building internally, because externally with grantees and with BIPOC-led and other equity-seeking communities, I can tell you for sure, at least in the experience of Indigenous-led organizations, they have generations of skill set and practice at storytelling, at research, at sense making, of identifying patterns, and of working towards sustainable, ethical stewardship and change for their communities. In fact, that is all that we've ever done. It's why we still exist. So I think that it's really important to just acknowledge that even in this conversation that we have to like flip the narrative a little bit about who actually thinks about and thinks about who knows better in these situations. And I really think that one of the ways to do better is to ensure that equity-seeking communities are actually leading their own desired research, and that even if you being settler created philanthropy or your adjudicators don't understand the methodology, or it doesn't seem rigorous or qualitative enough, that actually that is your worldview lens that needs to be corrected, not that of grassroots organizations, Indigenous-led organizations. And so I think that we need to do what we can to help support and influence philanthropic sector and adjudicators and others to recognize this and to adjust for it appropriately. Christian.
Thank you, Chris. I'll go straight to Dr. Iyer to build on this and give us her perspective.
Thanks. I think both Orville and Chris have raised some really important points around both seeing the gaps and also capacity, including among philanthropic foundations, to understand data or data-driven insights. I'd like to second those, and just a few things to add. One sort of, in terms of gaps, I think one question to sort of address is both, like, so seeing the gaps or what to fund, and data can highlight gaps in terms of who needs additional services, and so that you're influenced not only by advocacy or stronger ways of like the stronger voices, but also actually informed by needs and numbers. Like, so it can really serve as a barometer of assessment of actual state of affairs or actual field, rather than people who might have more capacity to advocate for additional funding. So that's one way in which actually data can serve to correct inequities. The second sort of thing in terms of doing better, and it's something to think about, I think balancing this need as we're thinking about newer and newer ways in data science for data harmonization. So could there be some opportunities in data harmonization? So we have some core things that we can talk about, while at the same time making sure that we acknowledge the risks with data harmonization in terms of the whole idea of co-design, communities or stakeholders having a voice in collecting data that makes sense to them. So how do you sort of balance the value of data harmonization, which allows funders, communities to evaluate things using common frameworks and share stories, and yet allow within that some opportunity for adaptation so that people can co-design and think about things that are meaningful to them. The third would be, I think, in some cases, it's important that on the one hand, data is really important for long-term resource mobilization or accountability. But I have certainly heard from the organizations that I've had the privilege of working through, particularly in Access, about sometimes how there's a lot of time and resources get spent collecting data and writing reports and justifying funds. And some organizations might have better infrastructure to be able to meet those requirements. So how do we, which is totally understandable, like we need the insights from data, we need the accountability from data, but how do we ensure that the requirements that data imposes don't perpetuate further inequity? So there might be groups that just don't have the infrastructure or the capacity or the time or energies required to do this on a regular basis. Is there a possibility also for philanthropy funded projects to think about emphasizing certain values within data? So instead of only data at the end of a project, could philanthropy have some values around open science, knowledge, the commitment to data for advocacy, the commitment to data for knowledge translation, insistence on some form of co-design and sharing back with the community? Could certain values be identified that then become ways that data is actually used not only for accountability, but accountability also to the community that the philanthropic sector is actually striving to benefit? So just some sort of thoughts, and I'm sure we can come back. I'd love to hear additional thoughts on some of these ideas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyer. Data harmonization, yes, but also acknowledging those risks that can come with it. So Tasha, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I must say I have a tough act to follow after these three brilliant people have spoken, and I think raised the key points, making sure that we're actioning our data, making sure we're actually doing the work of sense making of the data that we have, figuring out the appropriate ways of co-designing the data that we're collecting, and making sure that as funders, the obligations that we're placing on our grantees to be collecting data are not disproportionate with the resources that they have to do the programming and to do the other work. So I think those were some of the key takeaways that I had from the three people from what was already said. And I think in the notes that I had made before, it was I had kind of thought about the examples that we have of these glaring gaps that we have in data around the diversity of employees in the sector, diversity of board and other volunteers, diversity, data gaps around population served and leadership in organizations. And we have anecdotal data in all of these cases. And we know that there's glaring issues, but we also don't have necessarily the numbers. So I think in some ways it's overwhelming, but I think part of this is also that there's, what Orville said about actioning data really spoke loud and true to me among the other points. But we have a lot of data. We have a lot of data. And I just, yesterday, as I was thinking about what I was going to say today, the vital signs report from CFC came out that was focused on gender equality. And just a couple of data points from that report. Prior to the pandemic, poverty rates were already much higher for many groups of women compared to the national average of 14.9%. And then they go on to say single mothers and their children have a 30.4% poverty rate, First Nations women 34%, and non-permanent resident women 42%. So that's just one data point that was, came out in a report that was issued yesterday. 1 in 3 federally incarcerated women is Indigenous. Like, we have a lot of data, and we have to action on it. And I think, you know, there's been voices that have been screaming loud, not screaming, but calling out loudly for action for a long time. And as the philanthropic sector, we have to start listening, and we have to start finding proactively the organizations that are doing the work in new and innovative ways, and really take a posture, I think, of listening, and not listening just to confirm what we already know, but listening in a deep way for new learnings that will translate into hopefully the actions that we take.
Thank you, Tasha. So as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we thought this important conversation had to happen now, in particular in the context of developing a data strategy for funders. And so when we refer to data equity, inclusive philanthropy, I just wanted to hear from our panelists what would be their top 2 or 3 recommendations, pieces of advice for all philanthropic foundations to take into account while they're working together, but also with some, you know, key partners, key stakeholders to co-design this data strategy, which really aims to strengthen the collaboration between funders, the coordination, the use of resources to address maybe systemic issues, and, you know, more straightforward, you know, to measure or increase the positive impact that they want to have. And so I will start with Chris this time with this question.
Thank you, Ines. So I took some notes on this. I mean, I feel like I could have a multi-layered, long conversation with everyone about this. I find it really an important question. So 1, I think it's important to look to and fund BIPOC and other equity-seeking led organizations and their desired research and engagement work. Fund it robustly, fund it multi-year, and reduce the restrictions and reporting that is required. 2, I think that organizations really need to ask themselves, what can we learn? Who do we seek to serve? Are they present and engaged in positions of power and influence in this work? This is really about understanding and embedding the practices related to learning, to reflecting, and to recognizing that oftentimes pace is a way, so urgency and pace is a way that quality research gets undermined and continues to perpetuate harm, not just with equity-seeking communities, but just largely on humans. 3rd, as was saying, please take action on the existing wisdom that sits out there. Do not go and do another survey about the things that we know to be true. Take action on the calls that are there, and really just recognize that sometimes this desire for more research is a delay tactic. It's a way of kind of putting off to the side a question that we actually don't quite want to see the answer to, or waiting till there's enough data where maybe we can tell a good story rather than recognize that we have enough information to move. And so I think that's really key. And then finally, just I think it's important to acknowledge the extractive methodologies of data and research continues to this day to cause harm and perpetuate violence to BIPOC and other equity-seeking communities. And in the case of Indigenous communities, you know, we were greatly used as research subjects in Indian residential schools, and women were used as experimental objects for many, many years. Mm-hmm. And so recognizing that as a reality means that the engagement sometimes in some of these research and data coalitions can actually be, you know, I can be a little cautious engaging in them because I'm thinking about like, what is the extractive nature here and how might I actually be in a position to influence pace and relationship? And then the other piece is to recognize that more often than not, there are communities, Indigenous communities who've been saying for a long time, and BIPOC communities who've been saying for a very long time, that these are the issues and this is what we need to take care of. And what I think is happening right now is rather than thinking about how we can act on what communities are telling us they know to be true and be funding and supporting that, we can do that, and we can be doing the kinds of research and moving towards the kind of developmental reflective practices that give us more knowledge as we go along. It doesn't need to be one or the other.
Thank you, Chris. I'm absorbing what you just said. Let's go with Orville for this question next.
Thanks again, Inez. I think for me, in terms of this question, it's very key in terms of 2 or 3 recommendations for Philanthropic Foundation to co-design a data strategy. So here are my first 3 that I've brainstormed that I'm thinking now in terms of determining whether, first one is determining whether your funding is being equitably distributed traditionally towards underrepresented and underserved communities. And if not, what's the greatest inequities? Like where do the greatest inequities exist? You have to first ask yourself, where do those greatest inequities exist? And then, as I mentioned, we can't just see the need and not address it. So there needs to be action in terms of using this data to drive change in terms of our grant making practices, our decision making, our strategy, and our design. So that's the first piece in looking at who are the people, where's the funding being distributed, and is it traditionally being distributed to underrepresented and underserved groups. Second thing I'd want to note is to look at ways to decolonize the ways in which we track and receive data from our grantees. So when I say this, I'm looking at working from an anti-oppressive framework with our grantees and with your grantees, ensuring trust is central to the whole process. So it's as simple as not speaking at them, but speaking to them. Reviewing it involves them in the decision-making process. Reviewing program reporting tools and decolonizing the language and associated practices. So in particular, considering replacing the current narrative, for example, narrative reporting with other means of tracking data. So we're using roundtable reporting now as a means to track data with our grantees, and not recognizing that there's different ways to develop an approach that really involves our grantees and sharing their stories, and it works better with certain communities that really value that element of storytelling. So the other thing I wanted to mention was piggybacking on top of Chris's point on extractive method of extracting data from communities. I think that's so important. I think the key here is to really ensure the approach embodies trust and intentional inclusion of voices from the target communities to inform the direction of the data strategy. So we have to look at this whole process as, data is important, but yet there are communities that have been overly solicited in terms of data that they've been required to advocate for their own truth and well-being. And the reality is, communities shouldn't have to do that. It should be equitable across all lens. But unfortunately, due to systemic racism and institutionalized racism, it isn't. So it's really looking at trying to embody trust, not saying, okay, we're going to come in and to do this research project and just tick box it and we're out. It doesn't work like that. It's really working with the people, ensuring that their voices are being heard, ensuring that the target communities play a role in informing the current native, the data strategy, and embodying their voices. So actioning, looking at ways to decolonize and track the data, but also looking at embodying trust and inclusion in terms of the data strategy. I would say those are my top 3.
Thank you, Orville. Yeah, very inspiring. I mean, when we did have the first meeting on the data strategy for funders, my conclusion after that meeting with foundations mainly and some other key partners was that data is not only about metrics, it's about emotions. And we would need those deep data experts accompanied by psychologists like Dr. Iyer to help us out in this process and really explain to us what it does embody for some people and how it resonates in people's minds when we talk about data. And so Dr. Iyer, your perspectives or top 2-3 recommendations for foundations.
Sure, thanks. Again, I mean, I'll certainly reiterate a few things that Chris and Orwell said, so sorry for not being novel or innovative. Just a few points. The first I would say is that co-design is very important. So keeping in mind who is at the table and who is not at the table and why they may not be at the table. Co-designing data strategies or evaluation strategies with the stakeholders is super important. So if it's a youth project with young people, with communities, and also really valuing different types of knowledge and perspectives. So it can be the allure of data is such that sometimes we may prioritize and privilege certain types of knowledge that are more easily put into data, which is very important, but other types of knowledge like lived experience or stories. So it's really important to value different types of knowledge. So that's sort of the first recommendation. The second is that on the one hand, we do have a lot of data, but sometimes with data, you also need to still sit back and think about the assumptions when you see the data. I'll just give you an example. Yesterday, I was teaching my students, and we were talking about the association, which is very, very strong between poverty and poor mental health. And and there are there's tons of data for it. And if you look at the data, if you just look at it right away, you could do very different things based on how you interpret the data. If you interpret it as, the poverty and what it means in terms of lack of opportunities, like lack of opportunities, lack of stimulation, lack of just sort of, you might invest a lot in anti-poverty and like really working with communities, improving the quality of lives. And you would say, you looked at the data and you did something important. And would that be great? That would be fantastic. But if you looked at it from the other perspective and think about it in one perspective, like a lot of people with mental health problems don't have equitable access to jobs and employment. They are discriminated against. Often they have difficulties. So becoming vulnerable to mental health puts you at risk for poverty. So should you be investing then in also really improving access to care, in early intervention, and making sure that mental health services also integrate employment and education? Would that be a good use of this data? Yes. And then if you say, you know what, it's really not about poverty and poor mental health, but what's common to both is adverse childhood experiences. So should we really be focusing and putting a lot of your money and investment and policy in trying to reduce childhood trauma? Would that be a valuable use of money based on this data? And all three would be correct. So the data is just the same data, which is the association between poverty and poor mental health. But what you do with it can really come from your assumptions about what is driving that association. So what I'm trying to say is that this is just one example, but at times it can be very quick to look at the data and you really think you're making data-driven decision making, but even data-driven decision making has to carefully pause and think about the assumptions from which we are making decisions based on the data. And this sometimes can be tricky because you really think you're driven by evidence. Data is not evidence. Always behind the data, there are assumptions, and those assumptions need to be clarified. And not that they're right or wrong, but if you don't make explicit, you really feel very confident in the decisions you're making that are driven by data. And then my last point would be that data is power. Uh, and we really need, especially in a panel when we're talking about equity and inclusion, really acknowledge, especially in today's world, where almost everything we're doing is some form of data. Data is power, and power is not always a bad thing if it is driven and informed by the right values. But if not, you can do much more damage with data today than you can do at any other time in the past, because like we just have tons of data, we have lots of, so it really needs, so part of what I also worry about is as we're really thinking about machine learning and AI, and I think those are wonderful opportunities to think about what data could do to learn quickly. it's important to use those opportunities, but also not to lose the value of small data, small communities, your one person's story. So how do you make space in a society that's really about big numbers and large numbers and the power of large numbers, big data, all of which are super attractive? How do you integrate with that both values and still the value of, like, would you leave out small rural communities where 100 people live or 200 people live? You shouldn't, because again, you would then be perpetuating inequity and lack of inclusion. So how do you harness these opportunities? The only way, I would say, is really co-design and strong values and examination of assumptions, because data can really make you think that you're doing the right thing. But even with data-driven decisions, you are actually making assumptions, which are important to examine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyer. And I love how you link data and assumptions, but also values. I think that's a very, very important point. Thank you. Last but not least, Tasha.
Once again, a tough act to follow. I loved what each of you said, and I had made my notes that thank goodness overlap with what you said, because otherwise I would feel like I was way out in the park. But I'll be redundant if I go back to it, and at the same time, I think I'm kind of aware right now of being the only white person on this panel. And being in a grantor role, in a leadership role in a big foundation. This isn't part of my notes, but here I am. And what I'm hearing from each of you is, as I say, thank God, stuff is already on my radar that I'm aware of. And that in many cases feels overwhelming and paralyzing sometimes when we try to move forward. So I think that what I can add that's maybe different than what you said is everything you said, but also that for me on this learning journey, and I started with this also, is that I have to recognize that I'm on a learning process, and it's not a linear process, and that I'm going to make mistakes, and that can't stop me from trying to do my best with the best intentions. And I think that I'm saying this because so many, as in the questions it's pointed out, so many of our foundations are run by white people. And maybe because for a number of reasons, we're not moving forward on this in the way that I hope that we do. And I hope that I'm part of a solution, not continuing to perpetuate a problem. But we have to move forward, and it's not linear, and we can take small steps and big steps and leaps and just keep remembering that the process is important, that we have to be asking questions, we have to be consulting, we have to be inclusive, we have to be building those relationships of trust, we have to be acting on what we already know as we dig deeper. We have to be challenging our own assumptions, reflecting on our own power, but we also have to get started. So I think I'll leave it at that. I know there's a lot of good questions in the chat, so I'll let Ines manage those.
Thank you so much, Tasha. Yeah. So I think it's time for the questions now. We will go ahead and take some of them. We'll try to answer as many as we can. We do have only 10-12 minutes. And I'll start with the first one on my list here. And I think Dr. Iyer wanted to answer it. So the question is, I have found that data reveals assumptions and can help trigger change and renewal in an organizational culture. Could you describe how you understand the link between data and organizational culture renewal? Very hard for a Francophone to pronounce all these words one after the other. Thanks, Dr. Iyer.
I'm sure my fellow panelists will have really cool things to say about this as well. I did want to give one example. So, and again, we all come from the fields we come. So for a long time, as you know, in Canada, there were these massive investments to improve research, local Canadian research, by investing in what was called the Canada Research Chairs program. So Canada Research Chairs were funded across universities, and this was really seen as a way to push Canadian innovation and Canadian science. And it took a very long time to start collecting data about who's getting these positions, who in universities is getting these. And the minute they looked at it, guess what? They found that very few women, very few BIPOC individuals, like essentially it was like, so all it took was to ask for the data on this. And the minute they did that, the next sort of step was, you know what, you do need to do certain things to change the organizational culture. Like these numbers need to change, or your university will not get any more of these positions funded by the government. At the minute that was done, there was diversity and equity training so that recruitment, like faculty who are recruiting, know what to ask, what not to ask. They knew that these numbers matter, that you need to show an increase. And guess what? It's not that the quality of science is poorer now, but slowly who's being recruited at universities is changing. And with that, the culture of the departments is also changing. It's just a small example, but if you hadn't asked for the data in the first place, what we would have done is we wouldn't have realized that something as simple as just asking about who's getting these positions and who's not getting these positions, and in what form will that matter. Like it did change the culture around recruitment, around hiring, around just like, and it's, I mean, we're far from where we need to be, but certainly that data has helped begin the conversation around creating more diverse faculty in Canadian universities. And I know it's not an example from philanthropy necessarily, but I did think it's a really nice example of a simple use of data to trigger change.
Thank you, Dr. Iyer. Chris, I have a question for you so the question is, how measurement functions with a distinction between who serves and who is led by Indigenous communities, as traditionally philanthropy is structured to be accessed by whiteness. So I guess the question is about the distinction between the two.
Sure. And hi, Danny. I'm glad that you're here. Thanks for asking that question. I'm not completely sure that I understand, but just a couple of quick things come to my mind. One is, for us, the distinction between an Indigenous-led and Indigenous-informed organization and one that has Indigenous beneficiaries is important, because I can be honest that I have some assumptions that Indigenous-led and Indigenous-informed organizations actually have a better quality of service. That their program is more likely to have a positive impact and influence on the lives of the people that they touch, whether they're doing research or policy development, or whether they're doing child welfare reclamation work or education. And the reason for this distinction came out of measuring the Circle 1 and 2 that said, basically 1% of settler created philanthropic dollars are going to Indigenous charitable organizations or Indigenous issues. And then the Indigenous community said, well, wait a second. Like, that's actually not true. It's even less, because of that 1%, the majority of that 1% is still going to Indigenous benefiting organizations. Those are larger organizations who have the capacity to, say, like, write a ton of grants, and they have a donor and or a fund development staff team, etc. The reason for understanding this distinction is that we can actually begin to tell a very different story about the Indigenous charitable sector, and recognizing that it is a subsector of the nonprofit community that actually has a lot of lessons to teach broadly to this sector, as well as recognize that the legitimacy of Indigenous-led charitable organizations has been questioned for decades. And it's about time that we start to challenge that. And one of the ways to do that is to be able to use that data to tell a story that effectively says, hey, guess what, philanthropy? You say you care about all these issues related to justice and equity, but the funding for that work is barely going to the people who are most deeply impacted by these harms that are continuing in this world. So one of the things that I would also say about the importance for these distinctions is it is one part of a push for change and advocacy. The other thing that we would like to do, and the circle requires a multi-year operational investment in our research and knowledge mobilization vision. Our agenda going forward for the next several years is not only to talk about what settler philanthropy is not doing, but we want to highlight and elevate those that are doing really interesting work. And I have a bit of a bold question. What would this work look like? What would the experience of Indigenous and other equity-seeking communities look like if instead of 1% of funding, what about if we just went to 3%? What about if we just were at 3% of foundations' annual grant making? What would that do for communities? Sadly, I mean, it's embarrassing to talk about 3%. But I do think that there's another story to be told about how actually supporting equity-seeking communities actually supports the earth and humanity at a far greater rate than white-led organizations. And so if we could have people to be so bold as to say, whatever our number is, even if it's in the millions or the hundreds of thousands, if we look at how that is a percentage point, less than a percentage point of our overall grant making, and we can double it or triple it or quadruple it, then the question I'd love to ask is, how are we actually benefiting not only our equity-seeking communities, but humanity and the earth as a whole? And I think that right now, the time that we're in actually requires that kind of bold action. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So I have a question here about, and anyone can try to answer it. What do you think are the biggest barriers to obtain, information about the underfunded, marginalized groups within the philanthropy? Sorry?
I want to hop into that one right away, Inez. So I read that question and I chuckled, because that is actually some of the way that the circle has been treated by other organizations. We don't want to bother the circle. They're so small. They have so much going on. We don't want to bother them by asking them to be involved in this thing. So we'll just do it around them, or we'll fund other people to do it. So that first and foremost is not at all a movement towards empowerment. It's a movement towards working around and not honoring the agency of organizations to actually step into their fullest leadership. One of the things that you want to do to decrease undue burden on organizations, first, fund them abundantly. Fund them so that their organization is absolutely sustainable. They're able to pay all their staff a living wage, that they're able to provide benefits such as health benefits and pension, and ensure that this organization has multi-year sustainability and security so they can just do the work they want to do. When that happens, the likelihood of their desire and engagement to expand on their research agendas is probably going to grow exponentially. But the burden actually comes when organizations are asking the questions of labor. They're not funding organizations adequately to do that work. They're not providing adequate credit to do that work. And it is continuing a perpetuation of harm.
Thank you, Chris. So let me take a look at the questions that we still have. There are some statements. Some of them are questions. Some of them are more of a statement. Tasha, Dr. Iyer, or Bill, is there a question you would like to address that you can see in the Q&A box that you can't, keep yourself from wanting to answer?
So I'll answer the last one. Any advice on resisting the urge to center white identities in these conversations? So in terms of the advice I'd give in terms of centering, it goes back to the whole notion of what the whole purpose of equity is in philanthropy, and it's really looking at centering the voices of underrepresented and underserved communities and giving them an opportunity to drive change and build that into your whole strategy. So it's really looking at the the need at not just at a time now, but overarching and building it into your whole strategy. Because structural bias is something that's rooted within policies and practices that, you know, advantage some people and disadvantage others. So you're sitting at the intersection of power and privilege within within the philanthropic sector, and grant makers now have an opportunity, unique responsibility to implement grant making practices that promote equity and inclusion. So it's key that, you know, our professionals, our grant making program managers and grants managers have the power to ensure that the policies and practices give marginalized communities. And when I say marginalized, I'll even zoom in, because when we say racialized, oftentimes, you know, Black and Indigenous are at the back of that line, and giving those groups specific true philanthropic support rather than adding to the existing inequities. So at the same time, we need our CEOs to really challenge their board members and senior leaders so that we can have more increased diversity in decision makers, and strengthen the trust between donors and communities. It's key that we not just put out these statements that say, hey, we're at a moment after this senseless incident that happened in May with George Floyd. We're all putting out these statements around anti-Black racism, but the reality is it's more than just a communication exercise. We need to take action now. We need to really put this into place and ensure the communities, the voices that are underserved, are at the table. I mean, the time, if we were if we were to just to stay stagnant, then we would just we'd operating in complicity. So the reason why the George Floyd incident resonated with a variety of Black people for so long is because we recognized many of us could have met the same fate. And this is not something that's been happening overarching within months and months. It's now people have technology, and when you're putting that into a lens of philanthropy, it's around seeing the need and addressing the need, and I can't say it any further, and actioning it, and that's it.
Thank you, Orville. In the interest of time, I do realize we have only 5 minutes left. I will invite the panelists to answer the questions they want to answer in a communication that we will send to the participants. That's number one. Number two, because I think some of the questions need some answers. And two, Orville summed it up very well. I think I'm going to give you all the opportunity to share some final thoughts before we wrap up. And I'll go with Chris first, then Dr. Iyer, and then Tasha. You have 1 minute each.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate the acknowledgement from Dr. Iyer that data is power, and that the connotation that we carry at the Circle for Power is actually that we're talking about the deep-rooted ancestral power that is connected to justice and equity. And so one of the really quick things I would just invite organizations to go out and do is, as a really quick test of how rapidly you can gather data, take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, or to the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls calls to justice. Read those and ask yourself, how many dollars are you investing in enabling these calls to action and calls to justice? And how many of those dollars are being led by Indigenous organizations, or those that actually are the equity-seeking organizations at the center of them? Doing that exercise alone should probably give you enough data, enough information to know that you're not doing enough, and that you can do better. And you can start by doing better by being in relationship with organizations who are leading this work. Kukshem, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Dr. Iyer, please.
I think it's wonderful that as a group of philanthropy foundations, like you're asking some of these questions around data and data equity. I do think data is power, but it's also power that, if supported by the right values, can be used to actually advance people's lives. So data alone won't do that. Data driven by values, and data with an attempt to convert it into information and insights rather than numbers alone, can actually take us far. The other question I do want to answer is, there was one comment which is about are we simply sort of using the lack of data as an excuse to not proceed? And I think it's a very, very, very bold and courageous question, I would say. And some things are just straight up out there for us to know, like, that these are issues, this is inequity. And so the idea of having perfect data and perfect information can actually cause a lot of inertia. At every given point, we need to know we need the data, but we always have some data to act today on something. And knowing that it's imperfect and that it'll always be imperfect and that it's an iterative process. So not like data shouldn't become an excuse for not acting, and acknowledging that it's an iterative process. So I really did love that question about, like, do we need data to support some things that's straight up obvious and that's a problem? Can we act on it while still collecting data to know if our acting is making a difference or not?
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyer. And Tasha, some final thoughts?
Oh, when you invited me to this, Timothy and Ines, I sort of felt out of my depths, and I thought, well, I'm grappling with all these issues, so I'll accept. And after listening to you all, I continue to feel out of my depths, but also that I'm asking the right questions and that we're moving in the right direction. So I feel like this panel is a huge call to action for our foundation, the Foundation of Greater Montreal, but also hopefully for many of the other listeners, and that we will move forward and remember to call on people with expertise who are around this table, myself excluded, although I'm happy to talk and ask questions together. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the amazing insight that each of you have shared. And I look forward to continuing the work.
Thank you so much, Tasha, and thank you really to everyone. This was one of the most interesting conversations I've heard or participated in a while, and I really loved it. We appreciate you taking the time and being here with us. I'll just pass it over to Merve to conclude the webinar. And thank you so much, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to also thank our panelists for joining us in discussing an often overlooked but critically important subject for data in philanthropy. I'd like to remind our registration participants that Stacey McDonald from the Ontario Trillium Foundation will complement this session with a blog post that's going to be available next week. I'd also like to remind you that there is going to be a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to our recording and presentation slides. Next week, we're going to be discussing understanding and analyzing charity financials, and Mike Bernucci from CPA, and who is an auditor, will join us to discuss some of the topics that come up with the COVID-19 in mind. We are also launching a PFC virtual gathering that's taking place on November 17th to 19th. If you'd like, you can visit our website and access its programming and its sessions. And as always, we welcome everyone to subscribe to our digest and stay up to date with everything happening at PFC. Thank you so much for being here and have a great day. Thank you.